Hello, good afternoon, good evening. It's Dr. Carl here, welcoming you to our first virtual lecture for the Euro 2200 class on gender and modernism. I might look a little bit different because I've got my reading glasses on. And I might be kind of looking around on my screen to find various notes that I've put together. But essentially, I'm going to talk a bit about communism and Gustave Courbet. The introduction, a few minutes on communism, just because it is, does kind of infiltrate the artworks that we're going to look at later today and also on Friday in class. And also next week, pretty much all of the images that we're going to look at are were considered quite radical and different in the 1850s to the present time. And they changed quite strongly because of the publication by a German citizen called Karl Marx. And the impact of his publication, called the Communist Manifesto, has reverberations even today. I would argue that even what we saw happening, was it in Brazil this week with the speculation between, I can't remember, was it Brazil or between Bolsonaro and somebody da Silva? And really all over the world, continues to implicate how we live and what we fight for. So a few introductory words about Karl Marx. Like I said, Karl Marx studied law actually in Germany, in Bonn and Berlin, I think, but around 30, he took an interest in economics and started publishing a series of pamphlets, manifestos, which were both really well received and offended a lot of people. In fact, they were so offensive to some people that he was exiled. He had to leave the country. He went and lived in England, and stayed there for decades. He met a gentleman called Friedrich Engels, with whom he collaborated. He was also a philosopher / economist, and they continued to write, study, publish from England, and London is where Marx died. There's a really fabulous, I was going to say epitaph, that's not the right word, gravestone in a London cemetery with a massive carving of his head. He's quite a formidable figure. I read also he had a lot of health problems. He was a heavy drinker. Was not always the most pleasant person to be in the presence of. But he had such a affinity for his fellow humans, for humanity in general, that people scholars have considered his works, scholars have considered him to be the single most influential person in the history of mankind, and also above all the single most influential text, the Communist Manifesto written in the 19th century. Marx's affinity for his writing, for his subject matter, was so intense. He was so passionate, but he had very little sense for actually making money. He had a family that lived in total poverty, and he was basically supported by this professional partner of his, Engels. But like I said, the writings and the publications that they produced were unsurpassed in terms of their influence. So the Communist Manifesto was published, was a little 23-page pamphlet, was small. It came out first in 3 editions. It was written in German, and basically it spread like wildfire. It was published in several newspapers, published in German, and quickly translated into a lot of different languages. I think it reached the corners of definitely several countries in Europe, and then eventually around the world. It had a great deal of impact initially when it was published. Basically, it was so small and so simple that everyday people, everyday workers took to the streets and started revolting. They started rioting in the streets. And actually, I added 2 paintings from around that time, one that depicts the riots in Paris and one that depicts the riots in Berlin. Those are on the week's modules, just to give you a sense of what downtown Europe looked like in most major cities. And like I said, the manifesto was written so simply that it was really accessible to anybody who could read. It was not a piece of intellectual scholarship. It was written for everyday people to understand. In general, the text was, like I said, so well received. There were so many riots in countries, let me see. Well, it was published in 6 newspapers from England, the U.S., Austria, South Africa, eventually South America. Somewhere I wrote down all of the different countries. It was so well received initially around 1848, 1849, 1850. Like I said, there were riots in the streets of Europe that were so virulent and violent that tens of thousands of people lost their lives. And as a result of that, basically, Marx recoiled. The publications were shut down, and he kind of, went quiet a little bit for about 10 years until 10 or 20 years, actually, until about the 1870s, when he started publishing again. And that's when the ideas spread even more, and really haven't stopped since then. Think about the impact that tiny little publication had on a place like China, on a place like Russia, where, at least certainly in Russia, there was a full sort of nationwide revolution in 1917. Millions of people died in that, to say nothing of the royal family there. Anyways, the couple of main ideas that can be found in the Communist Manifesto, like I mentioned, Marx was primarily an economist. He was interested in the economy, how goods and services are sold and bought, what the prices of things are, and what people's standards of living were. And he came to be really concerned about how poorly people were living. He thought that people were really suffering. They weren't getting enough to eat. They weren't getting enough to pay their rents. This was before the time when people had cars, telephones, iPhones. Whoa. He was just talking about meeting their basic needs, and he was concerned that, in particular, the working classes, which he had a name for them, they were called the proletariat. He was concerned that the working classes were getting the short end of the stick. They were getting a raw deal. And he argued that they were under the thumb of the ruling classes, which he called the bourgeoisie or even the aristocracy. Now we know that the aristocracy is like the royalty, and they kind of played a special role, but you know, the other part of the ruling class is the bourgeoisie, which is kind of the middle, not the middlemen, but the middle classes, were the factory owners, the people who were that were in charge of things, rather than simply exchanging their labor for wages. Okay, so Marx felt that that everywhere he looked there was this tension and this struggle between the working classes and the ruling classes, and that they were in constant competition, and that, like I said, the working classes were getting the short end of the stick all the time. So this is what he wrote about in the Communist Manifesto. He wrote about these antagonisms under the general economic system, which we call capitalism, which he called capitalism. And he felt that by writing about it, this would increase their consciousness, the working class consciousness, about how bad they had it, and that maybe if they became conscious and they revolted, that this would bring about a classless society. He advocated actively for having revolutions, and for toppling capitalism and bringing about what he called emancipation. I think he argued, he said, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." That was his, if there was a logo for communism and for the year 1848, that was it. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Okay. Now, in addition to bringing about all of these revolutions, all of this blood spillage in the main cities of Europe, one of the direct targets of that violence and the anger of the proletariat were the European monarchs. Many of them were simply slaughtered, killed. And probably the most famous example is in Russia, in St. Petersburg. There was the Russian royal family called the Romanovs. There are a couple of popular films about how they were all, it was quite a sizable family, lots of children, and every last one, maybe every last one, there's always this argument, like, did Anastasia survive, and is there a secret princess tucked away somewhere in the back rooms of Europe? Anyways, that's probably the most famous family to be slaughtered. Yeah. I guess another thing to point out, sort of as an aside, a geographic aside, is to say that these ideas were not very well received in the U.S., which is our southern cousin, some people say. Particularly in the 1940s and 50s, so 100 years later, there was a virulent anti-communism under the leadership of Senator Joseph McCarthy. The U.S. had tribunals, basically, and not just the U.S., but in particular in Hollywood. Communism was kind of associated with treason, and there were several people that were tried for treason for just belonging to the Communist Party. And there were a couple of people that were even executed. I'm trying to think of the name of that famous couple. Can't think of them right now, but anyway, there were people that were accused of being Russian spies, of trying to spread communism on American soil, and they met with really, really strong resistance. And that kind of plays into why things are so different in the US than they are in Canada. Communism was quite well received. In fact, I have seen, I'm pretty sure that in the last election I saw a sign for the Canada Communist Party or the Guelph Communist Party. I can't remember. Anyway, there's no shame in being a communist here in Canada, and obviously we enjoy a lot of unions, which safeguard many of the standards of living, standards of work, workmen's compensation. Those all come out of Marx's writings in 1848 and beyond. Okay, done with the aside. What else to say about the revolutions? It's considered to be the most widespread revolutionary wave in Europe, in European history to date. And just, yeah, there were revolutions in Italy, France, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Sweden, Poland, Romania, Belgium, Ireland, and so on. Okay, now, I guess the thing that really interests us, beyond knowing the very basics about communism, is why does it matter to us when we're studying art, when we're studying artworks, works of writing, or paintings, music, what have you. Why do we care? And the answer is simple. The artists that we're studying read the Communist Manifesto, were exposed to his ideas, and were greatly influenced, and started making radically different artwork. And one of the best examples that we find is the work of Gustave Courbet. Now, there's one painting that we're really going to hone in on here, which is called the Stonebreakers. I believe it's from 1849. Unfortunately, it's a painting that no longer exists. We can no longer visit it in a museum. It was destroyed in the Second World War. It was bombed by Allies, unfortunately. That's our side. In some area close to Dresden, so nobody knows. Everybody's assumed, since it hasn't materialized, that it no longer exists. But luckily, there were photographs, and we still have this sort of written commentary about how it was received. And this is a painting of two gentlemen that are along a roadside in the country, outside, and we sort of see them, the sides of them in profile, and they're just out there bashing away at a bunch of rocks. It's a really kind of peculiar subject matter. They were painted by an artist called Gustave Courbet, who exhibited the work in 1850 in a sort of exhibition hall called a salon. And he, like I said, had been reading Marx and had been quite deeply impacted by Marx's concern for the proletariat, Marx's concern for the working man and woman. And so Courbet started to think about how he could translate Marx's ideas into visual imagery and how he could make an impact on German society. And he had this idea to paint some street workers, these two guys, out in the sticks, involved in manual labor. Now, there are so many reasons why this was such a important painting. The first of which is, actually I'm going to try and bring it up, of course I can't find it. Oh, maybe I can go on my, let's see. No, it's not that. How about here? Okay, I'm looking on my course link now. So above everything else, the important thing to say about it is that these are not typical subjects for a painting. At that time, if you were going to have a painting made, you were going to commission it, you were going to paint it, you were going to pay for it, sorry. And the only people that could afford to have their painting done were the middle classes and the upper classes. So when you went to galleries, you only saw paintings of wealthy people. I almost said pretty people, but, you know, wealthy people aren't always pretty. You saw paintings of wealthy people, usually in the best dress they owned or the best suit and tie, maybe the best hat that they owned, maybe some flowers in the hat. Almost always white people, although there are some exceptions, some nice exceptions. Almost always white people, Caucasians. And you saw them seated quite comfortably, posing, having the luxury to sit for extended periods of time in front of the painter for him to capture your likeness. And that was 99% of the time what you saw in a gallery, if it wasn't, say, a still life or a landscape or something like this. So already audiences would have been quite upset at the idea of seeing these two street workers. We could call them, or they were called at the time, peasants. They're very, very low-class people in the European system of values. There's two men. They're doing back-breaking work. They're not even standing up. One of them is on his knees. The other one is schlepping a basket of stones. And they're at work doing heavy manual labor. You can see that they're quite impoverished because of two things, I would say. First of all is the fact that the man on his knees is quite tanned. He's not sitting inside a little castle fanning himself from the sunshine, but rather he's out working hard in the sun. And they're both wearing quite tattered clothes. There are rips and tears all over their clothes. Look at the back of the standing boy. Look at the bottom of his pants. In fact, I don't think he has any socks on. There are rips and tears and patches all over their clothes. So that's really the primary indication that these two men are not out there having a good time. I think there's a couple of other indications in the painting. You can see in the background to the right, there is a pot, probably has some soup in there. There's one loaf of bread, a piece of bread for them to share, but they only have one spoon. They don't even have a spoon for each person to eat the soup. That's pretty dire when you don't even have your own spoon, I would say. They're out there probably hammering one of many cobblestones that are going to line the elegant streets of Paris for people's wagons or carriages to roll along. They also, quite significantly, are not looking at the viewer. They have their heads turned. And there's a lot of, that's a very specific kind of psychology. Are they looking away from us because they're ashamed of what they're doing? Are they looking away from us? Because they're so focused on what they're doing, that's probably the case. But in any case, the fact that they're looking away and not directly addressing the viewer is something that the painter Courbet chose very consciously to deny them of their individuality. This is not a portrait of an individual or a portrait of two individuals. They have become every man. They could be any man. They could be my grandfather and my brother. And that's the kind of status that Courbet wanted to communicate by denying the viewer that direct gaze. We're going to, Gaze, we're going to talk about the importance of gaze next week when we look at another painting by a French painter called Olympia by Edouard Manet. But suffice it to say, these peasants, workers, street workers are really they've been demoted. Finally, I would argue that the last way that they've been demoted is the fact that they're out there in the landscape at all. Really the only other people or entities that you would find alone in the land are animals, cows, deer, what have you. Those are the creatures that live out in the land, not human beings. Human beings are supposed to be in their elegant apartments in Paris, surrounded by the beautiful paintings of their relatives, right? So all of these devices in the painting really kind of conspire to present an image that was never seen before in the history of art. It was certainly never seen by Parisian audiences before. And most of them did not like it one bit. They were quite offended. They were disgusted. They wrote about how disgusted they were. They thought Courbet was a pig and that and a brute, one of those words that came into fashion around this time and a bit later. And they could not understand why he would be aggrandizing, celebrating these everyday, dirty, filthy street workers. And how did he aggrandize them? Well, this was a large painting. This was, the same size that one of, I was going to say one of Monet's paintings. That's not a logical comparison since Monet comes a bit later. But I don't know the exact dimensions, but this was, like 10 by 20 feet, something like that. A really large painting that upper-class Parisians went to see at the gallery. And like I said, were just horribly disgusted at what they saw and could not understand why they went and didn't find anything beautiful. They were looking for beauty, and instead Courbet was giving them realism with a capital R. Realism. This is, why should we paint beauty when this is the nature of life around us? This is the reality of most people's lives. It's not those princesses sitting on a throne with a feather in her hair. This is reality. That's what Courbet wanted to convey. I'm going to pause my recording right now and see if I can upload it to CourseLink.